This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a quick apology for my voice and lack of video. I'm just feeling a bit under the weather, so I am going to keep my video off today. But some of you might recognize our speaker today, Jurij, from past seminars this year. He's a very knowledgeable master gardener that we are very lucky to have joining us again today. He will be taking you through all things raised bed gardening. And we will be saving all questions for the end, but please feel free to put those in our Q&A chat, so we'll have them ready to get to at the end. All right, we can get started then.
Hello, everybody. If you've been outside yet this morning, or even if you look out the window, you know today is not a good gardening day. But it is a great day for planting your garden, and that's exactly what we're going to do over the next hour. I've been out there, and there's about 3 to 4 inches of the heaviest snow I've ever seen. It is just full of water, and each shovelful can get up to 20, 25 pounds. I am just thrilled that we were able to do this over Zoom. This was a backup for the for over and above the 25 or so people who would have been in attendance. But this turns out to be the direct way of presenting this this seminar. And I'm glad this was possible, because I wouldn't want to have to do that 30-mile trek from my end of the county over to Spencerport this morning. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, and you'll be able to see the slides that I'm going to talk to. Again, we're talking about raised bed gardening. My name is Jurij Kushner. You might not get Jurij out of the spelling of J-U-R-I-J, so just make those 2 J's silent and pronounce it Jurij when you're asking your questions later on. I've been gardening for well over 45 years. I try not to update this thing every year, at least not the first line. I became a master gardener in 2010. And have been enjoying this kind of educational outreach for many years. I was the former coordinator of the Parenton Community Garden. This is a 91 raised bed operation in downtown Fairport for the village of Fairport for the town of Parenton. And I'm also the sponsor and mentor for the YMCA gardens around the community. We have 6 YMCA gardens altogether at various branches of the Y. Just to get you in the mood for what we're going to be talking about, let's try this. Forget about the snow for a few minutes and watch this. I'll turn it off once I'm bored. Okay, here we go.
I can't see the screen, Jurij, the YouTube screen.
You can't see it?
Yeah, you might have to share that screen.
Still don't see it, huh?
No.
All right, well, this didn't work. It would have worked in person. Anyways, there's some very inspirational, well, I'll just talk you through it for a second, if I can get out of it now. How about that? Can you see it now?
No.
Okay. All right, we'll stop. Come on. We're going to do this again. All right. What it was a very inspirational video on raised bed gardens. They're just spectacular, well built, fenced in, everything you can imagine. Most of us as beginners in raised bed gardening won't get to that level of expertise or investment. It's probably very expensive to do that, but nevertheless, it really gets you excited when you see it. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But let me tell you, raised beds are not a guarantee of success. You still have to start with the 4 fundamental points in gardening, and make sure that you are on top of each one of those in order to be successful. First of all, it's always about location, location, location. If you're talking vegetable gardening, you are talking 6 to 8 hours minimum of sunlight every day. And if you can get 13 to 14 hours, you're much better off. And which is both of my vegetable gardens are situated in such a sunlight, of course, in July. And that helps ensure success in a vegetable garden. The second point is the soil. Despite the fact that soil may look good, it really is surprising when you break it down and find out how little organic material exists in the soil. It's usually 5 to 7% of the soil content is organic material. Organic material is essential for a successful garden and for the growth of plants. And so it is absolutely required to amend the soil every year. It's not a once every 5-year kind of thing. You just have to do it every year. And so going along with gardening and raised bed gardening in particular is composting, so that you create your own soil amendment to. Mulching is very important. Why mulching? Well, raised bed gardens do tend to dry out faster than gardens that are in the ground. They're upraised. They may have some leakage based on the construction quality and the materials that you use for the raised bed. So they're going to dry out faster than normal, which puts requirements on you for watering, which we'll get into, but also mulching. Mulching is great for retaining moisture and a lot of other things, which we'll talk about later. And then the final thing is tender loving care. There is no way you can be successful in vegetable gardening if you're not out in your garden, which means that the garden needs to be conveniently located, so that you don't say, oh, there's a reason, I have another excuse for not going out there today. It's too far, it's way in the corner, and so forth. Tender loving care involves being in the garden every day, not necessarily working in the garden every day, but being there, seeing the good things that are happening, and checking them off as, hey, I got my first tomato bloom, or I got my first tomato itself at the first thing that turned ripe, or whatever your success is, enjoy it. But also, if you have problems, catching them early is really important. The sooner you can catch a problem, the sooner you can possibly prevent it from spreading to its adjacent plants, from becoming a real issue later on in the year. Just as an example, tomatoes happen to get something called blossom end rot. You've probably all experienced it, those of you who have done gardening in the past. The bottom of the tomato turns black and hard as a rock. Once you spot that on a tomato, the first time you spot it on a tomato, which means if you're there every day, you can spot it relatively early when it's developing. Remove that tomato from the plant. Why have the plant continue to put energy into that tomato, which you'll never eat because of its problem? Now, blossom end rot is created by actually a calcium deficiency, which comes from irregular watering. So it's not a disease. It's something that unfortunately you may have contributed to by not watering it in the absence of rain. Nevertheless, getting it out of there is important. The only way you can get out of there is being in your garden every day. So it's not a guarantee of success, but let's count the ways where it contributes to success. First of all, you have the opportunity for the best soil mix. You basically load up that raised bed with your soil mix. So you can add the right nutrients, at least initially, to be amended every year, but to get it to where you want it. It does have good soil drainage. In fact, it may have too good soil drainage. So that is both an advantage, but also a disadvantage. Because of a raised bed should really never be larger than what you can reach into from the outside. You shouldn't have any soil compaction. And in those rare cases where you do have to step into the raised bed, if you see that it's happening on a regular basis, then what you should do is put a stone down and step on that stone and work off that stone or two, if necessary, in order to work your garden. But don't walk into the soil, because that's its greatest strength. The soil is not compacted. It should stay fluffy as it started, and promote plant growth. You can it almost automatically is a warmer temperature in the spring because of the raised bed and the fact that it's contained. And furthermore, you can easily put plastic over it in order to further warm up the soil and get started earlier in the spring. Not today. Ease of access. Obviously, if it's a 4x8, you should be able to walk all the way around it and be able to access any part of that raised bed from every direction. Weed control is a lot easier. The walls of the raised bed form a natural barrier for some weeds that kind of roll around the ground because they bump into let's say, an 8 or 12 inch high wall. But even those that fly in the air and drop into your garden, if you're there every day, you can catch them early and remove them with their full root system as easily as possible. And frankly, they're very beautiful. That's why it's such a disappointment that you didn't get to see the raised bed video that I had, because the beauty really came through. Okay, but as I said, but don't walk on the soil. The biggest advantage is the light, fluffy, perfect soil at the start. And what you want to do is to build them so you can always reach into the bed. If you have to, then you put it down a paver or a stone or a board and work off that as you need to work the plants. But I'll give you a suggestion for how to avoid doing that a lot. Here are the disadvantages of raised beds. Yep, it's a blank slide. No, that's a little excessive. Everything has a disadvantage, of course. You have to build it, and that does cost some money. Although you can build raised beds from a lot of used materials, and it can be relatively inexpensive. And as I said, you can build them out of many materials. I think I have a slide here that shows some examples of different materials. You can see the metal ones on the right and the left in the middle section probably are pretty expensive, whereas the use of cinder blocks or pallets or tree limbs is relatively inexpensive. But think about looking at those 9 alternatives. Think about what the question I mentioned about drainage. Obviously, the drainage in a metal Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I just got a message saying my microphone failed to detect. Okay, so the drainage in the metal containers probably is very minimal. But think about the drainage in that one on the bottom left-hand corner, the cinder blocks. You can see they only touch a very small piece towards the end, based on the way they're shaped and configured to, in this case, to form a circle. So you can imagine that the drainage really is accelerated there, and you'd have to do a lot of watering in that one. So depending on the material you use will influence watering and how much mulch you put in, by the way. Okay. You ask, well, how much soil do I need to fill these things? It's pure math, a very simple, hey, 8x4, which is the standard shape of a raised bed, and let's say you wanted 9 inches deep. If you do the math, 9 inches is 3/4 of a foot. It comes out to 24 cubic feet. That's a little bit under a cubic yard, so that it's pretty easy to calculate how much soil you will need, or soil or organic material that you're going to put in there. Because remember, you're not just going to put in soil. You may put in peat moss, you may put in compost, you may put in manure in the beginning, and to get it right up to the 9-inch level. If you're using a circular bed, you use that formula, pi r squared h, to determine how much soil you will need. But typically, it's not a lot to fill a raised bed. Okay, so there's got to be some more disadvantages. Yeah, I told you they tend to dry out faster. That's probably their one real disadvantage. The cost is something, but the cost is there for many years. And by the way, maybe a question that you've already posted or thinking about is, can I use pressure treated lumber for a raised bed? The answer in the past, and I've seen past, I mean 10 to 15 years ago, was no. The material that was used to create the pressure treatment was determined to be carcinogenic, so you would not want any leakage into your bed. But the materials that are used today are much safer. I still tend to avoid them. I still use pure pine if I'm building a wood bed. But the big difference between using pine and using pressure treated is probably 5 years life for a pine raised bed to perhaps 8 to 9 years. Wood is not inexpensive. So, and pressure treated lumber is actually more expensive than regular pine. Nevertheless, it is a cost saver to use pressure treated lumber in this application. But back to the drying out, some people go, some really religious people here, fanatics, will actually line their wooden raised bed with plastic. That is very hard to do, to get it to have it so that it doesn't break off on you, and it actually can hold the soil well without tearing. So moreover, I think you should spend more time thinking about irrigation for your raised bed, and drip irrigation is ideal. You're not watering over the top of the plants. You're not losing your moisture to evaporation. But if you're going to, and whether you're doing drip irrigation or any kind of irrigation, overhead sprinkler irrigation, the time to do it is early morning or early evening. You don't want to do it at midday when the sun is the hottest and a lot of your water is evaporating. And you don't want to just cover the surface and kind of feel like you've watered. You want to really get the water. I would prefer that you water twice a week, but get it down to a depth of 6 inches, as opposed to watering it daily with just a shallow covering on your soil surface. So raised beds, as far as I'm concerned, is the way to go. I have converted all of my vegetable gardening at my own home from in-ground to raised beds. I now have 7 raised beds that I have, and 3 of them are larger than 4x8. They're actually 4x20. And then I've got the balance are 4x8. So there's a significant amount of surface area to use. So it's really, as I consider, the ideal medium for doing vegetable gardening. So if you're going to go to the effort and the cost of building those raised beds, focus on maximizing productivity out of them. And maximizing productivity, or the yield that you get, does not mean maximizing the number of plants that you put into a raised bed. I had, when I was coordinator of the Parenton Community Garden, I would try to be on site as much as possible when gardeners who would rent their beds out, when they were there, which is typically Saturday mornings. So I would be there on site to help out if necessary, answer some questions and so forth. And but you can't always catch every gardener and know what they're up to. And unfortunately, it was, well into May, where one of the gardeners came up to me and said, "Hey, I think I may be having a problem with my carrots. Can you come over and look at them?" So I did, and the carrots look very nice, but I would say that there had to be at least 200 carrots per square foot were popping up. And obviously that is excessive. I mean, over a course of a square foot, you might want to have 16, 20, maybe 25 carrots in there in order to give them proper spacing so they can grow to a maturity. That obviously was excessive. I said, "Hey, they look great, but you have a lot of weeding to do and to get this down to the right size." So maximizing the number of plants is not what you're looking for. You're trying to increase the yield. They never reach full potential when they're overcrowded. A great starting point for knowing how much to put in are seed packets. Actually, the back of seed packet can be fascinating reading. They will tell you the height, the depth to plant your seed. They will tell you the distance apart to put the seed and so forth and so on, the temperatures and the rest. They're out there to try to get you to be a long-term customer. So they're giving you good advice. They've probably done empirical testing. They maybe even asked Cornell to do the testing for them, to give them a recommendation on what is the best distance apart for seed, for beet seeds or carrot seeds or whatever they're referring to. So they've done the work, and now they're trying to share their knowledge with you. Take advantage of it, is my suggestion. Okay, so how do you maximize? Well, you build up your soil, as we'll talk about amending the soil. You want to space your garden smartly, and I'll introduce you to a concept called square foot gardening as one way of doing that. Don't think of your raised bed as a horizontal plane. It's got a vertical to it. So grow up and take advantage of the fact that some plants love to grow up in the air. Mix it up, and we'll talk about what that means. Succession planting. There are, even in Rochester, New York, even with the snow that we have on the ground today and on March 4th, there is no reason why this gardening season can't produce 2 and maybe even 3 crops of the same variety over the course of the year. I definitely will get 3 radish crops out of this season. And often I can get 2 broccoli or early season crops like that in. And then you can also stretch your season. If you think about the season, let's say being from April to the end of September, maybe that's about 20 weeks. What if you could add 20% to that? And 20% is all it takes to add 20% to that growing season is to get 2 weeks earlier and 2 weeks later. And so that's one of the things we'll talk about. Just buying good topsoil, I presume it's going to be good, is not a guarantee in and of itself. It still may not contain enough organic material. They may have done a lot of weeding through that and running it over 2 or 3 times, but it may not have a lot of organic material. So that's still always a very important thing to do. Needs to be revitalized every year. You'll know you're ready when the soil is light, crumbly, and fluffy. Your goal is to keep it that way throughout the growing season. Compost, as I say, I compost everything that comes out of our any kind of garden scrap or vegetable scrap, plant tomato or fruit scrap. All that will go into the garden, into a compost pile, which then works its way into the garden. And it's actually some of the best material you can add to a garden. And then, some aficionados, even greater than me, will actually go into cover crops over the winter to add green manure to the soil over the winter. Spacing smartly. You know, we tend to think of gardening in straight rows, a row of carrots or a row of beets, or a row of tomatoes or whatever. Actually, a staggered plant row, or which then winds up, if you look at it from overhead, it will actually look like a triangle. Actually, you can get more plants into that configuration than you can into a straight row if you maintain the proper distances apart that are recommended. So think about that. I'll show you a picture of what I mean in just a second. So you don't want to space too tightly, and actually too tight spacing can stress the plants, and it also makes them more susceptible to disease or an insect attack. So if it attacks one, it may just very easily move on to the next one. I actually, given that I have the luxury of 7 beds, I actually don't put all my tomatoes in the same bed, for example, keep them physically apart. And I do that with a number of things. Peppers the same way, in order to help prevent the spread of disease. Hopefully you don't get it in the first place, but if it does, so it doesn't spread quickly. And then being there every day, hopefully I can spot it too. Here's a triangle, the triangle configuration, which actually is when you think about it, is really a staggered row of planting. So that helps get more plants into the space while maintaining the appropriate distances. I told you I was going to introduce you to square foot gardening. This is another approach to maximizing productivity. You can see that you can actually put strings or maybe even permanent markers on your bed, so you can see exactly where each of the square foot. This happens to be a 4x8, so there's 32 squares in there. So rather than rows, you're talking squares. You can make that permanent, or you can make it temporary to give it a try. You're still not going to walk on that soil. You can reach everything from around it. And then what you're going to do in every one of those squares is you could plant a different vegetable or flower. And typically you're going to either put 1, 4, 9, or 16 plants in each square foot. Now, obviously, you're not going to put 16 tomatoes in a square foot. You're going to put 1. But you might put 16, as I mentioned earlier, 16 carrots into a square foot. So you asked the question, well, how do I know? Well, I'll give you a little tip. But let's move on to the last bullet here. So as a result, you can harvest individual squares. And once you do, you can add compost and either replant it with the same crop that you had in there or something different. And this is where this is one technique for succession planting. All right, so there's a picture of the squares now at some stage of development. You can see broccoli, and you can see some marigolds and so forth in each square. All right, now I'm going to give a recommendation, but I'm going to give you the qualifier on it. First of all, this is a commercial site. It likes to sell you lots of things. I never even look at that stuff because it's very expensive. But I found that under their advice drop-down box, you get into something called a kitchen garden planner. Now, it's currently under construction. It's been under construction for a long time, and I just wrote them a note this morning because knowing that I was going to be providing this advice, I said, would you guys get this thing fixed? It's been over 6 months. But it's a wonderful tool when it's working. What it does is it allows you to configure your raised bed onto their platform. So you might have a 4x8, you might have a 5x10, you could have a 3x6, whatever design you have. I think it has to be rectangular, sorry, so it can't be circular. But you can configure it on there, and it will then create a drawing that represents your 3x6 or 4x8 or 5x10. And then it has pictures, icons of 70 different vegetables. There's probably something you might want to grow. There might be something you might want to grow that's beyond the 70, but let me tell you, 70 covers an awful lot of ground. And so what it does, it allows you to drag and drop a picture of, let's say, a carrot into the box. And once it does, once you drop it in there, it automatically expands that one carrot picture to as many carrots as is appropriate for a square foot. So if you took a tomato over there and dropped one in, it would stay one. If you put in arugula, you might get 4. If you put in carrots, as I said, it would be 16. And then, and even more importantly, what it does, it gives you a printout of a short printout of information about the plant that you picked and dropped into the drawing. So let me move on to the next slide and give you an example of that. This is arugula. I'm sorry, it said 16 arugula can go into a square foot. And then you can see the printout you get, which gives you all kinds of interesting information about spacing and harvesting and so forth. Now, this is just one square of the 32, let's say, in your 4x8 bed. So you can do this 31 more times and get ultimately you could have as much as, let's say, a 7 or 8 page printout of your entire garden as planted, with all this information that you can just print out and have with you. And now you have both a documentation of what you did do, and you have some suggestions of what you should do during the growing season for that particular plant. So it really represents a tremendous tool when it's working. So I am looking forward to the day that Kitchen Garden Planner is up and running. They actually have pre-planned kitchen garden planners already there on the site that are working. So you can just look at their design and say, hey, do I want to do something exactly like that? Then you can do it. But if you want the one that is interactive, that's the one that's not working. So good luck, and I hope that this works. I'd like to use it myself again. I said you need to think about the raised bed not just as a horizontal plane, but also the vertical aspects to it. You can grow up and both save space, but more importantly, you can incorporate plants that like growing up in the air. And you can do that with nets and cages and poles, lattices, whatever. Cucumbers, for example, love growing up in the air. They like the wind blowing through the leaves. It accelerates their growth and so forth. It also, of course, as I've said before, there's always a trade-off. Yes, it grows up in the air, but as a result, the wind is also drying out the plant, and therefore it requires more moisture, more irrigation. Tomatoes, obviously, particularly the indeterminate tomatoes that they can grow pretty high. Tomato cages or strings are essential for those. Pole beans, by nature, the word pole beans means it likes to grow up in the air. So that's an example. So I would, you're saving space in that precious 32 square feet, and you're getting more yield, and you're creating a very nice look to your garden. It may require more moisture and perhaps some more fertilization, because they will dry out faster, but it's a great way of increasing productivity in your garden. Let's move on. And here's a couple of pictures of that situation where you can grow up those lattice or that netting to save space and do the things that you want to do. Now, I will tell you that there's another trade-off with growing up, and that is shade. Think about it. That lattice, particularly with plants growing on it, will create a lot of shade for the rest of the garden, or potentially could. So you have to think about very strategically where to put that lattice or that trellis. We'll talk about that later. All right, mixing it up. Interplanting compatible crops also goes a long way to save space within that environment. The concept of compatible plants and interplanting actually stems from the Three Sisters concept corn, beans, and squash, because the Indians actually grew those things together, and they had, perfect logic for doing it. The corn stalks obviously grow tall. The pole beans on them work their way around the corn stalks and grow. And then the squash, and these are typically winter squashes, not the plants, but the sprawling vine type of squash, will grow along the ground and keep everything a little bit moister. It'll shade out weeds, but also keep the ground a little bit moister. So they're compatible. They work with each other. They actually support each other, and they grow in the same space essentially. My version of the same concept of mixing it up is carrots and radishes. Let me tell you why. First of all, both are early season crops. So, there's a real chance that we could start growing these in the ground sometime in the first couple of weeks of April from seed directly into the ground. The problem with carrots is, first of all, the seed is incredibly small to begin with. So if you've got fat fingers like I do, it's not easy to plant. I got a solution for that problem too. But nevertheless, let's just start with the fact that carrots, and I like to plant them about 2 inches apart because I like nice thick carrots during the season, and particularly at season end when I store them for the winter. But they take about 20 to 25 days to actually pop through the ground. From the time you put them in the seed in the ground to the time you actually see a little bit of growth. And even that little bit of growth requires you to get down on your hands and knees and look real carefully to spot the carrots. Well, as I get older, I'm having more and more difficulty remembering where I planted those things for 21 to 25 days. So that's a problem. Now, radishes, on the other hand, they pop up in 8 to 10 days. They're remarkable how quickly they will pop. And once they burst through the ground, they really grow fast. Typically, you can get a radish harvest within 45 to 50 days from planting. So I put them in the same row. So what I'll do is I'll put a carrot, a radish, a carrot, a radish in the row. And as a result, what happens is the radishes pop up in 10 days. I now know exactly where that row is that is going to have carrots in another 10 to 15 days later. And those radishes actually can be removed, harvested, about 40 days later from the time I first spot them popping through the ground. So they're actually out of the way before the carrots even are close to being grown. And as a result, I can either, those holes that I've created where the radishes were, I can put another carrot seed in there, or I can put another radish seed in there, frankly, and it would still work. But so it helps me trace the row, but it also it doesn't compete with the carrot. And it's a very simple way of doing combination plants in the same row. I told you the carrot seeds are incredibly small. One of the things I do is I actually make seed tape. I take a roll of toilet paper and cut a 6-foot length and then cut that up to 6 feet. So I create 3 strings of toilet paper, maybe 1.5 inches wide or inch wide and 6 feet long. And I dab some water and flour mixture, which turns into kind of gluish every 2 inches. Put the seed into that glue right there at the kitchen table, where it's a lot easier to handle seeds as opposed to out in the garden where you've already got your hands wet and you got soil on them and so forth. And then I just plant the entire 6-foot length of toilet paper into the same area that I would have planted the individual seeds, and it comes up just as successfully. So just a little point. Okay, here's another example where you can take advantage of the fact that in this case, arugula and onions or garlic. Obviously, the onions and the garlic primarily grow below grade, where the arugula grows above grade. So as a result, you can bring these plants closer together while not competing with the most important piece of that particular plant. And so it doesn't get too congested in there. We've already mentioned this a couple of times, but let's do it again. You can grow more than one crop in a given space in the course of a season. Early lettuce, for example, can very easily, you can get two crops of lettuce. If you're going to try to do that, though, I would recommend using transplants as opposed to growing from seed. That will accelerate or reduce the amount of time between that allows the plant to mature and develop fruit. And then even within that transplant, you'll sometimes see some things come to maturity in 50 days, some things take 70 days. Well, you got a better chance if you have two 50-day maturities than two 70-day maturities. And in between those two crop plantings, make sure you replenish the soil with some compost. And then I mentioned also that we can stretch our season. If we can get those extra weeks, that really goes a long way. One of the ways of doing this is use the picture that you see. Those are called cold frames or row covers specifically, and they actually have doorways in the front and in the back, so you can close them at night. So they will keep the soil just a little bit in the spring. You can get them a little bit warmer and plant in a warmer condition, and in the fall you can keep the soil and the air a little bit warmer to let things develop and mature completely. Really interesting idea, which I think I have a slide on the next one. Yeah, you can see you can also stretch your season by adding some warmth to that row cover. So for example, in the top left, everyone knows milk bottles, milk cans, jugs. Fill them up with water, let them sit out in the sun during the day. They will warm up, but at night, as you close off that row cover, stick them inside the row cover. They will give off some heat during the evening, overnight, to keep it just a little bit warmer. And then in the morning, when you're opening up the row cover, pull them out, let them get exposed to the sun all day and collect some more heat. The one on the right really is ingenious. Those are pop bottle 2 liter, 3 liter containers. They're all filled with all the outside ones are filled with water. The inside one actually has the bottom cut off, and that's the one that sits on top of the plant. So now you've covered the plant, and you've given a complete 360 of insulation for that plant for that evening. Ingenious as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, the one in the middle is one of these expensive closures that probably cost you $200. So I tend to stay away from things like that. Okay, a couple of other tips. Think about the plants that need a lot of attention. So for example, lettuce needs a lot of attention because you're going to be harvesting on a regular basis. So you're going to be in there. So put that towards the edge. But things that don't need a lot of care and not a lot of attention, you can put in the middle of the bed to further make it easier to reach everything, because you don't have to reach into there that often if it doesn't need a lot of attention. So I tend to grow carrots primarily for storage for the winter when I don't have access to relatively inexpensive carrots at grocery stores. So as a result, I can plant them and leave them alone during most of the summer. So I put those in the middle of my garden, where things like, as I say, lettuce, you want to put on the outside because you're always going to be fussing with it. You're always going to be cutting it off a piece or cleaning it up or whatever. Another point that I alluded to I was going to make was taller plants, or in the case of the lattices and trellises that you might use to grow things up. Put them on the north or west side of your garden, whereas the smaller things put towards the south or eastern end of your garden. This winds up being one of the biggest responsibilities of a community garden coordinator, because you will have one bed that is right next to someone else's bed. So you may not be worried about casting shadow on your own garden, but what if you're casting shadow on someone else's? Now you got a feud going on between two neighbors. So your job is to make sure that there are no feuds, no fights at a community garden as coordinator. So I had to restrict the height and again, insist if you're going to have anything that on the way up, it's got to be on the north side. Let me show you a picture of that just in case my words don't completely capture what I'm trying to say. So there's a simple garden. You can see north and west, east and south. Put your taller plants to the north side and to the west side. Put your low maintenance plants as much as possible in the middle of the garden. And then put your shorter plants on the east and on the south side of the garden. Now, shade is not always a bad thing. Think about a garden that has tomatoes and lettuce in it. One of the problems with lettuce, it's an early spring crop, but once it gets warm, lettuce tends to bolt. It overnight, some nights after repeated 80-degree, 85-degree days, what happens, it has this growth spurt, and this stuff is hard and not edible. So having a tomato plant cast a shadow on lettuce might keep it from warming up as quickly. If you had an early spring heat wave, so to speak, it might keep it a little bit cooler for that lettuce and delay the bolting. The bolting almost always occurs sometime during the season, but if you can keep it from happening longer, the better. And then, of course, when it does bolt, I would remove the plant and put in some compost and put in a second crop and start all over again. And then this is my final slide. There are some things you can do in a vegetable garden over the winter. First and foremost, always clean it up. Don't leave it with organic material on the surface. You left your tomato plants or whatever, I'll clean this up in the spring. All you're doing is encouraging disease and encouraging animals to set up a home in your garden. So clean it up by all means. And then you can just leave it alone. Just let it rest for the winter and come back the following year. Another idea, though, is you could plant garlic. Garlic uniquely, almost. No, it's not uniquely, because I'll tell you about another idea that I read about recently. Garlic is perfectly conducive to planting in the fall. In fact, I planted on Halloween. So on Halloween, the ground is still nice and ready for planting. I'll put in 100 garlic cloves into the soil. What happens is they'll start creating roots even before winter. They'll go dormant during the coldest months when the snow's on top of it. But then in the spring, it'll be one of the first things to pop through. It's already up. So all it does is reinvigorates itself and starts growing, so that you have a harvest in, that should say July, August, not August, September. Typically July, August, you'll see the garlic will kind of keel over. It'll turn yellow and keel over the garlic leaves. And that's when you can harvest. I always save about 10 to 15% of my garlic crop for the next year's seeds. But you can, it's really easy to plant garlic, but here's something you can do in your garden. And then I said, for those real aficionados, they would like to add nitrogen back into their soil over and above any composting that they do, which adds nutrients, but not necessarily nitrogen. Legume plants are known for their ability to fixate nitrogen and add that to the soil. So you can do things like planting a red clover or annual ryegrasses in the fall. Let that grow. It'll create a cover on the garden. You have to turn that over, so there's work involved in the spring before you can replant. But it does add a lot of nutrients. There's one little hesitation in that the nutrients that come out of this process really start really accumulating in May. So if you're going to use this bed for early season crop in April, you're going to miss a lot of the benefits of what you did. But the combination of doing this kind of cover crop in the fall, and then saying that's the garden I'm going to put in my later season crops, such as tomatoes or not potatoes, peppers, which typically you will not even start thinking about planting until towards the end of May. You know, that old rule around here of Memorial Day for tomatoes really still does work. I mean, they've accelerated the date to maybe May 15th now because they claim global warming is causing that. I don't know. I still use Memorial Day as the time I plant my tomatoes, and it seems to work. Avoids. I don't get the benefit of an early start. In some years you clearly could, but I don't take the risk of frost that will kill off your tomatoes and then have to start all over again anyways. So on Memorial Day. So it works pretty well. And if you have that combination of doing this cover crop and a later planting, you're really in great shape. So that's the presentation. I need to get back into video here, don't I? And I would love to take your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Jurij. Yeah, we'll take any questions in the Q&A chat, so feel free to add anything to that. We do have a couple waiting. All right, first one is, I want to put straw around my plants this summer. Is that okay?
Straw as mulch is fantastic. By the way, you just reminded me of something. Back to the slide there I was talking about what you can do in your garden. I read an article this past summer, that one of the things you can plant in the garden is potatoes over the winter, just like garlic. Get them in the ground in October, and they will get started, and then they will be up much earlier than they otherwise would be if you started planting in April or May. I'm going to give that a try this year as an experiment. We'll see what happens. And one of the things, again, connection to straw, is that they also showed me how to build a planter out of chicken wire and straw and soil, layered up, and having potato plants coming out of every layer. So within a 4-foot high chicken wire container, you could have about 5 or 6 layers of straw, soil, and planted potatoes, and having potatoes come out the sides. It looks ingenious. I'm going to give it a try. I like doing this kind of experimentation, but I would agree that straw, it makes a very nice mulch for your garden.
Great. All right, next is, at the end of the growing season, after cleaning out all the old growth, do you recommend covering the raised beds with mulch for the winter?
It's not absolutely necessary. It can't hurt, but depending on what you're going to have to do in the spring, and you may be, if you do not rototilling, but if you do turn over your soil, you're going to put that into the soil. But that's good because mulch often decays and will become compost. So that's a nice way of doing it. So yeah, it doesn't hurt. I actually sometimes will even in the fall, I still that's when I harvest a lot of things like beets and carrots that I want for winter storage. Typically the tops, the greens of those particular plants are not edible the way they would be, let's say, earlier in the season. So I tend to cut them off, and then I cut them into very, very, very fine pieces. So carrots, I might have the carrot top, I might cut into 1/4-inch pieces, or the same with the beet top, and I'll put that onto the soil too, and then I work it in right then and there, and that will decay because it's so fine. It's not a big chunks. It'll decay on its own as compost in the soil. So it really works well, both for on the top, but also working some into your garden at the time of final cleanup in the fall, in September, October.
All right. Next question is, how often do you test soil / how do you test soil, and then acid or base?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of techniques. The Cornell Crop Extension will actually provide a service. There's a fee for that. I don't know what it is, but they'll give you actually a better, more information than just, you know, the acid level of, or the pH level of your soil. They'll give you all kinds of additional data to tell you other ingredients, nutrients and chemicals that are in the soil. Magnesium and so forth, things that you might not even be able to test for. If you want a simple pH test, you can buy those typically at most garden places. They're relatively simple. You take a little sample of soil, mix it in with liquid, drop in a few drops of the solution they want you to put in there, and then compare it, litmus test comparison to known values, and it'll give you an answer. Obviously, they may not be very reliable, but they do. They're relatively inexpensive. Around here, you know, for the most part, the soil is roughly the same. It's in the 6.5 to 7.5 range, which is right in the middle. 7 is exactly in the middle. So you often won't find much variation, but it is a good idea to test your soil at least once, and then. And if you're doing it, though, might as well, if you're going to do it right, the one time every, let's say, 5 or 6 years that you do it, don't just sample from one spot in your raised bed. You know, maybe get 2 or 3 spots, different corners or the middle or whatever. So you know how uniform the pH is throughout your bed, just in case something went wrong. Now, by the way, while we're talking about pH, usually, because I said normally the soil falls into 6.5 to 7.5, your goal will be to try to reduce the pH, make it more acidic, so that it can support and really encourage some a couple of important things like blueberries or potatoes, hydrangeas, flowers also like low high acid levels, low pH, and so. You're probably going to be adding sulfur. Sulfur is the relatively inexpensive thing to do to reduce pH, but it's so much easier to make a dent in reducing the pH in a raised bed, a contained location. Container is even easier in a contained location than in the ground, because in the ground there are so many things happening that you have no clue about when you're standing on the surface. The underwater movement and of soil and air and whatever is remarkable, and caused by worms and other critters. You never know what's going on underneath there. So adding sulfur won't go a long way to improving your acid level. In a raised bed, you got a fighting chance. Thank you. Anything else?
This person is asking for some advice for growing strawberries.
Yeah. Strawberries are relatively easy to grow. The harder part is containing them. They really, after they've had their growth in June, or you can get ever-bearing ones too, but they tend to throw out runners and start up new plants in places that you didn't intend to. So you can start out with a row, but then it's a little, you have to do some maintenance work in order to maintain that row. But the nice thing about it is you can cut those runners off and actually plant that new plant where you want it, so that you almost have your never-ending supply of plants. Once you buy the first ones, you can have them for a long time.
All right, next question is, how do you know how much to water?
Typically, you want to add about 1 to 1.5 inches of water a week to your garden, maybe a little bit more in the early spring when you're planting. Now, hopefully most of that will come from rain, as opposed to you having to add it. So what I recommend is getting yourself a rain gauge and kind of think about it 1 week at a time. Rainfall that I needed to support the 1 to 1.5 inches this week. If not, I need to add water. And as I mentioned before, I would recommend not doing it midday, doing it early morning or early evening. If you can do it with a drip irrigation system, that's better than overhead. But if you're going to do overhead watering from a hose or some kind of a sprinkler, what you want to try to do is go to the stem of the plant, put the water near the stem as opposed to on the leaves, because they're going to evaporate if they go on the leaves. So 1 to 1.5 inches, a little bit more in the spring when you first starting your seeds or your plant or transplants.
All right. Somebody asked, you had mentioned 7% organic. Is there a way to test for that?
I do think that you would get that from Cornell Crop Extension, how much is organic, but even if you don't, you can just assume that and just assume you have to add compost every year.
All right. When doing square foot gardening, do we worry about cross pollination? Are we planting similar plants throughout the bed?
No, you don't have to plant similar plants. So that's really not a big concern. Not really a big concern.
All right. And then when planting garlic, you said you plant 100 bulbs.
Yeah.
How do you use that bed during the season with so many garlic plants coming up?
Well, it definitely occupies the space. So that's a portion of my raised bed that's committed to garlic. Simple as that.
All right. And then what about spaghetti squash? Should that be in its own raised bed?
I guess I don't. It could. I don't know why that couldn't grow with other things though. There's no inherent, to my mind at least, there's no inherent reason why it has to be on its own. Now I don't like spaghetti squash, so that's one reason I would put it all by itself.
All right. What are the most successful vegetables to plant in beds besides what was mentioned? Tomatoes, peppers, carrots.
Tomatoes, peppers, carrots, cucumbers, clearly would be good. I wouldn't do corn, honestly. There's so many good corn farmers around here and it's relatively inexpensive. You never know what this year's prices will look like, but I just don't want to tie up too much soil, particularly not a raised bed garden soil for corn. So I wouldn't recommend that. I actually love growing beans, whether they're bush beans or pole beans. Brussels sprouts are interesting growth and particularly enjoyable to watch them grow and form. You got to be careful. They do tend to attract a lot of insects and therefore get a little buggy. But that goes with their nature. You have to clean them up before you eat them anyways. I also grow, I said I grow radishes, peppers. I have orange peppers and red peppers and yellow peppers. And they all start green when they first come out. So as a result, you get a fourth color too, if you harvest it a little bit earlier than when it comes to full maturity. I grow asparagus. That's a perennial crop, so that's an interesting thing to do in your garden. If you do grow asparagus, though, don't be disappointed if you don't really get much in the first couple of years. It really takes about 3 to 4 years to establish a asparagus bed, and then from then you should be fine. We talked about garlic, onions. We didn't talk about onions. I tend to grow onions from seed or sets. Those are early season crops too. And I happen to grow, my wife loves edamame. So I have one bed that is just dedicated to edamame, which is a soybean. So that's another nice crop but that one you can't plant until even after tomatoes and peppers. So it's probably an early June planting, and for a late August, early September harvest. So that would be my recommendations. But you can hear more about good crops to plant. Kelly, do you know when I'm doing Gardener's Favorites? I think it's in
I
Henrietta.
believe that you have one in Brockport and one in either Webster or Henrietta at the end of
Yeah,
this
I think
month.
it's Henrietta. So that's coming up later on this month,
Yep.
towards the back end of the month. So come and join us either in person or on Zoom.
Perfect. Someone asked, what determines the height of the walls of the beds?
Well, it really to your preference. If you know you're going to be growing a lot of things that root crops, I would recommend that the raised bed be taller, so 10 to 12 inches. If you're not into root crops, 9 inches probably is sufficient. There's a cost difference between a 9-inch piece of wood and a 12-inch piece of wood, so that could enter your thinking. But my beds are typically 10 inches, and I'll have 9 to 10 inch. I try to have the soil level at the 9-inch level at all times, so that I go through a big effort of adding soil in the fall before winter, so that I don't have to worry about that in the spring.
All right. Can you use peat moss as opposed to mulch?
You can, absolutely you can. It's now you're talking a higher cost typically, but yes, peat moss is pretty expensive, and it's becoming rarer. Very few places harvest peat moss anymore.
All right. How do you store your carrots over winter?
Great question. Now you got me just in my wheelhouse. You will not believe what I do to store my carrots. Okay. So in October, November, I pull all the carrots that I've been growing all summer long. I cut off the greens that I told you about, and I'll slice them into real small pieces and use them as compost. I then pack. I put some right in a bag and bring them right in the kitchen. But they like to be stored at about 32 degrees, and there aren't too many places in your home that are 32 degrees other than your refrigerator, and you can't tie up your refrigerator with lots of carrots. So what I do is the ones I need immediately, I'll put in the house, but the balance I will put into these containers. They're plastic containers that I get from Wegmans and from their confectionery department. I drill some holes in the bottom to just in case any moisture gets inside, they can drain through the bottom. I fill them up with carrots. I just stack the carrots right on top of each other, fit them in as tight as I can in between, close the lid real tight, and then bury it in the ground at the depth of about 20 inches. So this container, which is probably 8-inch square at the top, I bury into the ground, and I have about 6 inches of opening over the top before I hit the soil level and I use a raised bed to do this of the bed. What I then do is, rather than covering it with soil, which would freeze over and I wouldn't be able to get access to that container, what I do is I take either straw or pine needles. I happen to have some pine trees, and I get pine needles that fall in the fall. I put them over the top, and although they freeze to each other as opposed to the ground. And so as a result, when I come there in the fall, like in the winter, like I made this afternoon to get some carrots, I have a stake in the ground. I know exactly where that container is, even if there's 10 inches of snow on top. Clear off the snow, remove this cover of straw or pine needles. I actually put a stone on top of that in order to make sure that they don't blow away in the winter. So I remove the stone first, then I remove the straw, and now I have access to the lid of the container. And I can either pull the entire container out if I need a whole bunch of carrots, or open it up and remove the number of carrots that I need. I have a bag with me, so I put them right in the bag, and those go in the house. Then I can close the container. And that's why I am careful to have holes in the bottom, because during this closing process, some snow may fall in to the container. And when I push it, when it goes back into the ground, it may be warm enough that it melts and causes some damage to the carrots. So I avoid that by having these holes in the bottom, and lit it up, put the straw back on top, put the stone back on top, and the snow will take care of itself. It'll cover it over again when it snows the next time. And I'm good to go until the next time I need access to my carrots. A lot of work, I understand, but if you like carrots the way I do, and you've grown a lot of them, it's a great way of doing it. The conditions are perfect. I once had a lecture in April, late April, at Tinker Park, and that morning of the lecture, it was about 10 o'clock when the lecture started, on vegetable gardening. And that morning I dug up my last container unopened, brought it to the lecture, put it on the table in front of this audience of 25 or 30 people, never said a word until the appropriate time in the presentation. And I said, I need a volunteer. And so one woman raised her hand. She came up. I said, I want you to help me open this container up. And we opened it, and she pulled out this gorgeous beet, and all of them were gorgeous. They looked just the way they did when I put them in there 6 months earlier. So it really works. And I was taking a big risk, but that it might have been mush in there, but it worked out just fine, and had a great time with it.
All right. When do you plant the cover crop? Before the season's harvest is finished, or after all the plants are removed?
After.
All right. And what are determinate tomatoes?
The determinate and indeterminate. Determinate usually are the ones that are kind of bush shaped in nature, and they will get to be about 3 to 4 feet tall max, where the indeterminate can really grow. So you have these stories of people, my tomato is 12 feet tall, inside a tomato cage. Indeterminates can do that and will continuously throw out and ripen at different times at different portions of the plant, where determinate, usually the bunch of tomatoes all come at roughly the same time. It's a lot like winter squash and summer squash. Summer squash is a plant that grows up to 2 feet tall, and you either get your summer squashes or your spaghetti squashes or whatever, where the winter squashes are a vine that will spread quite a bit, and your squash, Waltham butternut squash as an example, will grow at different points in the vine, and often they will grow outside the raised bed. So in fact, that's one of the things that I would put towards the edge of a raised bed, and knowing that it's going to grow, either create a trellis for it to grow up, the vine to grow up, or to grow out of the garden. If you have fencing around your raised bed garden, that's not a bad situation, where you let it grow out of the garden and then up the fencing. So.
All right. Do you / can you stain or treat the raised garden planter wood?
Can you? Well, I suppose you can. You want to be absolutely certain that there's nothing in the stain that could be a problem. I just wouldn't do it. I just played safe and wouldn't do it. But if you get assurances, you read all the everything about the ingredients, and make sure that there's no potential carcinogenic stuff in there, I presume it would help preserve the wood a little bit longer.
Do I need to rotate the location of vegetables within the garden season over season?
No, I would say every maybe 2 or 3 years, I would rotate, except in one very clear example. If you ever were to get tomato blight, which is a ugly disease, the tomato will wither and die off. You cannot put a tomato plant in there for the following year, even if you've done the perfect job of cleaning up the bed, removing anything that might have fallen off that tomato plant, any stem, any leaf, whatever. You've done a complete thorough job of cleaning the surface. You're taking a high risk by putting another tomato and even putting in anything that's in the tomato family, and peppers happen to be in the tomato family. So I would avoid putting, so I would definitely have to rotate some. If you're going to use that ground the following year, then you want to put something completely unrelated to the tomato family, the nightshade family. So that's an example where you must rotate or let it lay fallow for the following year. But in normal healthy conditions, a rotation every 3 years probably is a great idea. So that's one of the reasons why keeping a log and an as-is drawing of what you're doing is very helpful, to remind you what you had there last year, and therefore, if this happens to be the rotation year, it's very easy to do that rotation as opposed to trying to remember what I had where.
Any recommendations to prevent tomato rot?
That blossom end rot, yeah, water regularly. So that 1.5 inch of water, do that very carefully. Make sure that you take into consideration how much rainfall you get and how much more you have to add and when you add that water. So just do it on a regular basis, as opposed to, hey, I'll water it when I get to it, kind of thing. So and you can stop it. So even if you get it once you get back on a regular pattern, it will go away, and you will remove, of course, those tomatoes that have it in the first place.
And if you're using drip watering, how do you know how much you are watering?
Well, here's a thought. Tuna fish cans happen to be about 1 inch high. So if you kind of place them in a little hole in your garden, maybe 2 or 3 of them at the corners or the middle, and then let your irrigation system go, you would see how much is actually getting into the tuna fish can and how much water you've added to the bed.
Is there anything special I need to do if there are black walnut trees nearby? Will using a raised bed mitigate the effect of black walnut on soil?
Well, it depends on how close. The answer before you added the impact of raised beds is stay away from it. So the answer is the same with a raised bed. Keep your raised bed away from the black walnut. It just adds chemicals to the soil that will just destroy plants. So you want to stay as far away as you can, and you should be okay in a raised bed. You're probably better off in a raised bed than in the ground.
All right. If I'm growing a standard mix of tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and etc., is there any particular nutrient I need to make sure I replenish?
I'm not sure I could answer that one. I think if you just add a nice amount of compost as you're planting those things, I always add to the hole that I dig for tomatoes or peppers. I always fill it at least partially, halfway, with compost and soil, not just soil, not just put back the soil that I used to create the hole in the first place. So I think that adds the nutrients that you need.
All right, just a couple more here. How deep should raised bed soil be?
I like to keep it about 1 inch from the top. So if you're a 12-inch frame, then you want to have 11 inches of soil. If you have a 10-inch, then keep it 9 inches.
All right. Any recommendations for a good variety of lettuce for this area?
Yeah, you can get seed packs that have mixed lettuce seeds in them. I think I always like to do that. But romaine works pretty well here. It doesn't come out looking like the romaine that you're familiar with, at a store, but it is pretty tasty. I've never had luck with iceberg. I don't know whether our growing season is just too short or whatever, but I've never had luck with iceberg. So I think the bushy arugula type and mixed lettuces are probably the best idea around here.
All right. Do you recommend growing peppers from seed or transplants?
Transplant. I am not. I've never really had much success. Maybe I just don't have the interest in doing this in February, March, when you should be starting seeds from in the home. And if you don't start then starting from seed in May is probably a little too late. So I go with transplants.
All right. Do you treat for grubs or other pests in your own raised bed?
No, I use I try to use as little chemical as possible on the lawn and in the beds. It takes my biggest issue I have is Japanese beetles, and I will just walk around and knock them off plants and into a bucket of water with soap in it, and let them do a couple hours of swimming, and then they expire. But I don't use a lot of chemicals, and so I haven't really had any grub problems for a long time. So thank goodness.
Yeah. Do you use cages for determinate tomatoes?
You can, you don't have to, because they will grow to a height and stop. So it's not a big problem. I would probably just stake them, put a wooden stake and give them a little bit of support, but I wouldn't necessarily use a cage. I'll use the cage for the indeterminate ones.
All right. What's a good companion plant to tomatoes?
Well, as I said, you could do lettuce with it. It would help the lettuce keep it cool. I'd have to research that. I don't know other than the lettuce and the specific reason why I would put lettuce next to it.
All right. Have you ever tried growing tomatillos?
No, I have not.
What flowers should I plant among my vegetables to attract bees / deter bugs and pests?
Well, the marigolds always work well. So I tend to put marigolds in the four corners of my raised beds. If you have a known problem, nasturtiums sometimes will, if you're willing to sacrifice the nasturtiums in particular, they will attract aphids. So if you want to keep the aphids off other things, they'll go on to the nasturtiums. So those are the two that I would consider.
All right. What proportion of soil, mulch, compost, manure, etc. is best for starting new beds?
I would make sure that the manure, compost portion is 15 to 20%.
All right, and then last one here. I've
Yeah.
heard that Epsom salts added to the hole where one plants tomatoes is beneficial. Any
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, I would add some Epsom salt when planting the tomato. It's supposed to make it sweeter.
All right, perfect. And I think that was all the questions we had.
Great.
All right, thank you so much, Yuri.
Okay.
Always so informative, and I know everybody that comes really appreciates
Now
everything you
have
to
a good
share.
gardening season. Not today though.
Yes, and we got a little while, it seems.
All right, Kelly, you're going to send me a total count here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll send it in the chat.
All right. Very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Bye.